Good morning, Jamshed bhai. How are you? Good morning. I am good, brother. Hello, good morning, Mr. Athasham. How are you, brother? Yeah, good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Yeah, good morning, brother.
How are you, sir? How is your health?
I'm fine. I'm good.
That's great, sir.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning and welcome, Vikash bhai. How are you? Today, let us begin now. Today, I propose to engage you and invite your special attention due to the nature of topic, and that is the definition of a refugee. We have to analyze, understand the idea of refugee definition from different angles, perspectives, approaches, conceptualizations, and different point of views, including the political one, anthropological, sociological, legal, economic, historical, cultural, and some other important dimensions which have not been engrafted in the existing scholarship, but these perspectives have always been there. In this particular engagement, my dear friends, I would be submitting for your kind perusal and consideration the doctrine of refugeehood and what exactly are the contours of the institution of refugeehood in our part of the world, as well as in other continents, countries, regions. We would also be evaluating, while taking into consideration our constitutional positions, our political positions, and our positions within the architecture of international law, as well as at micro level, it is international refugee law. we would be conceptualizing the idea of refugee and why there is a definition and why this definition has become so controversial, so contentious in different regions and nations on this beautiful planet. We would also be appreciating on the critical footing different clauses of this particular definition as it has been enunciated in 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees and its additional protocol of 1967, along with regional definitions, national definitions, and other important juristic and scholarship-driven definitions. We have to make a distinction who is a refugee, who is an asylum seeker, who is a migrant, who is an immigrant, and so on and so forth. And what exactly are the different categorizations and compartmentalization of our understanding when we are visiting this idea of refugee definition. We have to take into account how to determine and appreciate on the critical footing the idea of refugee definition in a group, a refugee definition in individual perspective, and we have to take into account the place of gender in refugee definition and how the women refugees, war refugees, child refugees have been appreciated and how and what kind of a protection has been made available under this particular existing definition that has been recognized at international level and provided in 1951 Refugee Convention. So at the same time, we are also supposed to appreciate different situations, different circumstances, and cumulatively we have to assess what exactly has been the impact of this definition on refugee movement. The basic and the most fundamental question that arises at this stage is, who is a refugee? And we have to provide and appreciate existing definition as well as the legal rights and what exactly is the range of rights which is available to refugees and what kind of a regime is there for the protection that is being implemented. At the same time, there is another important interrogatory mark on the existing definition that has been provided in 1951 Convention, that is the concept of refugee. Does the concept of a refugee or is the concept of a refugee outmoded in the post-Cold War era? That is the most important question. Or post-Cold War era, or in a scenario where we have been talking of a multipolarity of the global posts. How to understand the scale and scope of the refugee crisis and the reasons that people become refugees and the impact on their lives. That is another important burning question in the contemporary circumstances. At the same time, we have to take into account the criteria of cause or the criteria cause or need for flight or other important factors, and how should we try to determine access to international protection. That is the another important question even in the post global compact scenario. How have states sought to narrow the convention definition? Because definition, as I have submitted on earlier occasions, my submissions, my dear friends, that the majority of the nation states, particularly hailing from the global south nation states or global south region of the world, national governments are not comfortable with the existing contours of the definition that has been provided in 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. And therefore, in this kind of a situation, there is another important question: is immediate life-threatening violence too stringent a requirement as per the existing definition? is the requirement that an asylum applicant be targeted for persecution coherent, cohesive, and congenial? Should it be admitted? Then how should the credible fear standard be understood in the contemporary circumstances of the refugee crisis? These are some of the important ancillary questions. You may also come out with your own understanding on the basis of your intellectually agitational dimensional questions. There is another facet to it. Can economic harms amount to persecution? Because one of the most important ingredient of this definition clause is persecution. And unfortunately, both at the same time, definition does not provide the definition, or this convention does not provide any kind of a definition of the term persecution. There are merits not to provide, and there are demerits not to provide a definition of the term persecution. But I would be following the first one. There are a lot of benefits not to have a definition of persecution, because it is the non-definition dimension of the term persecution that creates a lot of flexibility, lot of relaxation, and lot of critical appreciation of new situations. Because when we are having some kind of a definition, then the definition, generally we do not try to review them. Whatever the definitions and the clauses have been, the meaning which are generally assigned in a specific piece of legislation within the municipal legal system, then it becomes the duty of the judicial mind to apply that particular understanding to a particular expression that has been assigned in the legislation itself. Beyond that, generally it has been the practice within the municipal legal system. Judicial system does not go beyond that. Same is the situation with that of international law. If the definitions are there, we would be appreciating the definition that has been provided of a stateless person in 1954 convention. So the definition that again created a lot of problems, and same is the situation here. So it is very fortunate situation that the definition of the term persecution has not been provided, and this is my individual personal understanding. My dear friends, you've got every right to differ with me. So I can give you further examples when we are talking of definition. Suppose there is, let me crystallize it for a better clarity, terrorist versus criminal. So how should one distinguish between legitimate criminal prosecution and governmental persecution? There are two important, paradigms. Therefore, we have to be very careful, because in refugee situations, governments have been found culpable in committing persecution. So we have to distinguish between prosecution, criminal prosecution, and persecution. These are the two important. And the line of distinction generally in majority of the cases gets blurred because of the political interpretations, not legal interpretations. Then what special problems arise, my dear friends, in applying refugee standards in civil war situations? When is a government unable to control a non-state persecuting group? That is an additional dimension. And there is another important question: what is a social group? Because membership of a social group has also been provided as one of the grounds in the definition clause. Then, is asylum an appropriate response to domestic violence, female genital mutilation, population policies? How can or should one decide what is fundamental to someone's identity? Because the identity is a very very important element even in the refugee definition. And we have to identify some positive contributions made by refugees in the host countries. Because the refugees have always been considered as a liability of the hosting state. And in the last week, in the last 10 days, I have attended some of the important seminars, not seminars but webinars, organized by the Oxford University's Refugee Studies Center. And this was one of the most important question, and I also posed this question in that very webinar. That why refugees are considered or regarded as a liability in the host state. Why their voices, their talents, their skills, their contributions are not conspicuously acknowledged by the host countries in the nation building. So we have to think on a critical footing. Critically thinking or critically think that particularly about and discuss issues relating to asylum and refuge in the most affected regions in the world. We have to, at the same time, analyze the media reporting. Because the media has also created a lot of misconceptions and myths about refugees in the host countries. And media has also become a part of the governmental thinking. And it has become a global fashion. We cannot point out a single country that the media has become bad in a particular geopolitical entity. This is not the situation. So I'm not here to talk of the media, media pluralism or media freedom, but what I am deriving home, my only contention is the depiction of refugees in media reporting. That should be our concern as a student of international law as well as a student of international refugee law. And therefore, in this particular context, we are supposed to answer certain important additional questions. How does the person feel about becoming a refugee and how he is reported by the media? Why did they become refugee? What things make life as a refugee hard? What could be done to improve the situation of refugees in the current what we call circumstances? Is there anything the refugee says that surprises us? What and why? If I put myself in the shoes of a person who is a refugee, then I generally ask this question to myself: how do I think I would feel? Would I do anything differently? These are some of the important and tricky situations which I try to contemplate for myself. Because the definition takes into account a very, very important ingredient, and that ingredient constitutes a very, very important understanding, and that understanding still remains to be answered, it still remains to be understood. And that is the threshold of fear, the definition of fear, the province of fear, evaluation of fear. But before I proceed further, I am having some problems with the term refugee. Because when we are talking of this particular term, as a layman, as a student of higher education, as a student of particularly of law, as a student of sociology, as a student of political science, as a student of history, we are having different understandings of this particular expression. I'm sorry. Because the term refugee, my dear friends, conjures up a million of bleak images. It's a kind of a cocktail of sufferings, a melange of obscure images. A teeming boat adrift in the South China Sea, we have witnessed in the past. We have also witnessed a bloated child in Bangladesh. We have also witnessed arrival of a Syrian child on the Mediterranean seashores that really shaken to the entire conscience of the global humanity, and that in the subsequent days also hogged the international limelight. We have also been witnessing, or we have also witnessed, my dear friends, a shanty town reduced to rubble in Beirut. We have also witnessed the harrowing experiences which have been documented in black and white in the form of videos, movies, films, the stories of the First World War and Second World War, where the biggest casualty has been the civilian population. And they have always been on the run, on the move. In recent years, we have also witnessed the Gulf War first and the Gulf War second. And right now, we have also been witnessing since 2011 the civil war in Syria, Yemen, and other important geopolitical entities of the global South nation states. Therefore, my dear friends, determining conceptually, if not politically, who is or who is not a refugee would appear to be a relatively simple manner or simple matter. A refugee, we might say, my dear friends, is a person fleeing life-threatening conditions. That is the most basic understanding of this particular expression, who is a refugee. In daily parlance, and for journalistic purposes, my dear friends, as I have been talking of media depiction of refugees, this is roughly the meaning of the institution of refugeehood. So far, journalistic provinces are concerned, journalistic understandings are concerned. Predictably, in legal and political circles, my dear friends, among those officials who formulate refugee policies for states and international agencies, the meaning is considerably more circumscribed when we are talking of the institution of refugees. The predominant generation-old scholarly treatise identify the refugee as an essence or in a gist. So far, the institution of refugeehood is concerned. A person who has crossed an international frontier because of a well-founded fear of persecution, given such broad agreement the conceptual problem would appear to be resolved. But these appearances, my dear friends, are a kind of an intellectual, in my personal understanding, is an intellectual, juridical, and conceptual camouflage. It is very deceptive. It's a kind of a mirage that has not been properly understood. So that is the situation which has been what we call created. So in such a situation, my dear friends, what is important is that we have to undertake these dimensions in a manner which requires a very, very important understanding. If you take these understandings, you will find that the refugee problem has always been a political project, which has never been accepted by the geopolitical institutions. It has never received any kind of governmental acknowledgement that there exists a political dimension to the refugee crisis or global refugee crisis. But as I have submitted on earlier occasions, my dear friends, it has been recognized now a political project, a political implication. Therefore, a conception of refugee is not strictly speaking a definition. There are in fact dozens of definitions presently operating in various national jurisdictions of this particular expression, which is known as refugee. Majority of the nation states have their own municipal definitions or national definitions, the majority of which follow the construction of 1951 UN Convention on Refugees. If you take into account the germane passage of 1951 Refugee Convention, where we find a definition of this particular expression, that is refugee, you will find that this convention defines a refugee. It starts like this: a refugee is a person owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted, because of the reasons or for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion, and at the same time is also outside the country of his nationality. And at the same time, my dear friend, it is further supplemented his outsideness. He is not in a position, because of the fear, he is not in a position to avail the protection of his country of nationality, and unwilling to avail himself of the country, I mean the protection of that very country in which he finds in a given situation. So such concrete definitions are predicated on an implicit argument, or implicit argument may also be taken as a conception that there appears to be, my dear friends, a bond of trust, loyalty, protection and assistance between the citizens and the state constitute the normal basis of every society. But in case of refugee, this bond has been severed, gets eliminated. And the persecution and alienage are always the physical manifestations of this eliminated relationship or eliminated bond. Therefore, these manifestations are the necessary and sufficient conditions for determining the institution of refugee-hood in a given situation. Therefore, the conception or conceptualization of this particular understanding is primarily the theoretical basis for this particular definition that has been provided in 1951 Refugee Convention. This definition of 1951 Convention stipulates, my dear friends, what is essential and universal about refugeehood. This definition of 1951 Convention asserts both a moral and an empirical claim. Moral because it posits the existence of a normal minimal relation of rights and duties between the citizens and the state. And the negation of which, my dear friends, endangers refugees. On the other hand, so far the empirical claim is concerned, 1951 Convention definition asserts that the actual consequences of this eliminated bond or relationship are always persecution, alienage. Therefore, the definition of refugee adopted by the Organization of African Unity is the only salient challenge to the proposition that persecution is an essential criteria of refugeehood. OAU definition, after incorporating United Nations persecution-based phraseology, proceeds, my dear friends, to state that term refugee shall also apply. Once again, I draw your attention, shall also apply within inverted commas. It means OAU Convention, as I have already submitted, my dear friends, OAU Convention does not adopt a different line of argument, but it articulates on the basis of supplementarity, on the basis of complementarity of that very definition that it has already subsumed in its understanding and that has been provided in 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees. And therefore, this particular term, refugee, shall also apply. Then there are some specific grounds, and these grounds, to every person it shall apply, owing to external aggression, owing to occupation, owing to foreign domination, and at the same time, events seriously disturbing public order in either part or whole of his or her country of origin, nationality, homeland, and natural habitation. So this kind of understanding we find at the regional level. And why it is done? It is done that that very person who is seeking some kind of a refugee status in another place outside his country of nationality, if we take into account Article 13 and Article 14 of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Then, my dear friends, it is clearly established, if you take into account these two important dimensions, Organization of African Unity Charter and the UN definitions reflect conspicuously different historical contexts. UN definitions, or UN definition, I should say, was a response to the European totalitarian experiences, when indeed refugees were primarily the persecuted victims of highly organized predatory states. And unfortunately, my dear friends, the similar states still exist in the contemporary world order. I'm sorry to say. The Organization of African Unity definition provides and realizes this particular line of argument which I have submitted. Because it is the canvas of juridical thinking. It is the canvas of intellectual imagination. It is the canvas of future prognostications that we find collectively in the definition provided by the Organization of African Unity Charter. Because in today's circumstances, the liberal space is shrinking in the public domain. Even extremism has been presented in many geopolitical entities as a manifestation of liberalism. Whether it is China, North Korea, and other nation states, their idea of liberalism is nothing but it is the whims and maxims of the governmental providence. So therefore, they are having a different kind of an orientation of liberalism. But if you take into account OAU definition, then we are of the view that OAU definition or Organization of African Unity Charter definition recognizes, my dear friends, that the normal bond between the citizen and the state can be severed in diverse ways. It means it has also recognized the diversity of circumstances which ultimately pandered to persecution. Persecution is one of the important grounds out of this particular diversity. Societies periodically, my dear friends, disintegrate because of their frailty rather than because of their ferocity. Victims of domestic divisions or foreign interventions if you take into account all these dimensions which I have been sharing with you, you will find a resonance of my submissions in the light of AAU definition. A proper conception of refugeehood is a very, very important public engagement. International communities' clumsy and ad hoc responses to refugee emergencies are, of course, primarily due to the reluctance of the sovereign states to grant political deference, political reverence, and financial support to the relevant international agencies. Their hesitancy in assuming the burdens of material relief, asylum and resettlement, and their concerns that the assisting refugees could adversely implicate other foreign policy objectives. However, the problem is only partially attributable to the political conflicts. And political conflicts are generally necessitated, my dear friends, by resource scarcity. This has also created some kind of a conceptual confusion. Conceptual confusions, particularly regarding the true meaning and the true nature of the institution of refugeehood and the causes of the refugeehood. and what exactly it should be. I mean, the entire modus operandi which has to be designed for the control, management, and monitoring of this kind of a confusion. Ultimately, this conceptual confusion contributed to the misery of both refugee and host and the inflammation of international tensions. Because an overly narrow conception of refugee will contribute to the denial of international protection to countries, to countless people, to societies, when they find themselves quagmired in the dire consequences or the dire circumstances. Unfortunately, for many persons who find themselves at the brink of a disaster, refugee status is a privileged position. It's a very, very important institution. Whereas there are destitute people, and refugees status is generally sought by these kinds of people, because refugee is eligible for many forms of international assistance, including material relief, asylum status, permanent resettlement, or entire what you call range of durable solutions. Whereas there is a requirement of an inclusive conception and conceptualization in the form of moral convictions as well as the humanitarian trust, which is generally absent when the national governments are going under hostile circumstances going to provide some kind of a humanitarian relief to the people who are seeking refugee status or claiming international assistance. So in such a situation, my dear friends, it becomes very, very important, because if you take into account the entire forced displaced population, you will realize that how this particular definition is going to be evaluated. This reminds me of another important dimension of the convention definition. When I say I use this expression convention definition, I am attributing this expression to 1951 convention relating to the status of refugees. Convention definition initiates with the refugee as someone with a well-founded fear of persecution. Refugee is someone who is unable or unwilling. Again, I am emphasizing, and I would also be evaluating as a complete categorizations, because we have to conduct some kind of an intellectual autopsy, some kind of a dissection on this particular definition provided under 1951 convention. So, my dear friends, a refugee as someone who is unable or unwilling by reasons of well-founded fear to use or take advantage of protection of their government. 1951 Convention's first crux of orientation is individual as a rights holder relevant to the well-founded dimension. And that is the most important objection that is generally voiced by the people and scholars from the global South nation states or from the Afro-Asian nation states. Historically speaking, my dear friends, the references to protection in Article 1 have been perceived predominantly as references to diplomatic and consular protection to ensure rights at home. But if you see the progressive evolution of refugee law as established the local and territorial protection of refugees as integral part of the refugee definition. The refugee definition stipulates, my dear friends, that the determination of a well-founded fear of persecution exists. And this has been, visited in one of the most important decisions. In 2006 by the United Kingdom House of Lords. And that is Januzzi and others versus Secretary of State for Home Department. So, if you take into account this entire, journey of, refugee protection, then you will realize, my dear friends, that refugee definition has always been a controversial premise. Because though we can take some kind of a solace, we can achieve some kind of a satisfaction in the sense that one of the outstanding achievements of the 20th century in the field of humanitarianism has been the establishment of the principle that the refugee problem is a matter of concern to the international community, to the global community of the civilized nation states. And therefore, this realization has ultimately conferred an attribute, an understanding which is relating to civility, dignity, humanity. And that is why we can claim rightly and call ourselves a member of the community of civilized nation states. If the global community of nation states or committee of nations cannot accept refugees, cannot realize that the refugees are also human beings, then it does not have the moral authority to address itself with an adjective called civilized. And therefore, when we say civilized nation states, it must realize that it must recognize that there is another important population, and this is a global population, which does not belong to a single nation state, rather it belongs to the entire humanity. And that is the refugee population. Refugee population, my dear friends, should be equated with the concept of high seas. I consider refugee population as the common heritage of mankind, as we generally considered many important regions of the world, whether it is Antarctica, whether it is high seas, whether it is seabed, or other important regions above the sea, beneath the sea, we generally address them. Not a matter of a single sovereignty, rather the global sovereignty is exercised over them. Same is I am stressing this particular argument that refugees are the common heritage of mankind, because it is our it has been the collective wisdom of the nation states. I am not attributing to a single nation state. If we see the generation of refugees, if we see refugee flows, if we see refugee influxes, refugee exoduses, refugee movement, refugee relocation by crossing international borders or the geopolitical entities borders, then it becomes the common heritage of mankind. And this is something I have been imagining in the 2016 New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants, whereunder we have received two important program of actions, which is popularly known as the non-binding programs, which is today known as the Global Compacts on Refugees and Migrants. So, my dear friends, it is not the responsibility of a one single nation state to address the problem of refugees. Therefore, right now we are seized with an understanding how to understand refugee definition. Therefore, if you take into account, then there has been a unanimity even prior to the incorporation conclusion of the United Nations Charter. Refugee problem must be addressed to the context of international cooperation and burden sharing responsibility principles. Though the word responsibility is a later addition, earlier it used to be confined only two important expressions with an hyphen in between, and that was burden sharing. This particular notion of burden sharing first came into existence after the First World War, my dear friends, particularly under the auspices of the League of Nations, which was called upon to deal with successive waves of refugees. It was further developed and strengthened after the Second World War. Through continuing action undertaken by the United Nations to address numerous refugee situations in all regions of the world. Such refugee situations remain a tragic feature of our troubled times. Even it has also been queried further by the global pandemic or the COVID-19 pandemic. International cooperation is in dealing with refugee problems presupposes collective action by governments in working out appropriate durable solutions for refugees. International conceptualization or international cooperation, or the idea of durable solutions, which has been presented as one of the most important cooperation manifestation at international level, has also been found insufficient in the subsequent years. And therefore, if you take into account the convention definition, regional definitions, national definitions, and other juristic understandings of this expression called refugee, then one particular notion emerges out of this entire cauldron, and that is nothing but the idea of complementarity. It means every definition that has been provided in the national law, in the regional understanding or the regional convention or some national legislation, it must create some kind of a connect between the international refugee law definition and the national law definition. Both definitions should be amalgamated at the level of adjudication and providing and making available a range of rights to the refugees. That should be the judicial policy, that should be the yardstick by which the judicial measures, administrative measures, as well as ad hoc measures are or likely to be undertaken or should be taken. Because when we say refugee is someone due to a well-founded fear of persecution, war or violence has been forced to flee their home country, then the legal definition or the legal definition of the term refugee that has been set in the scheme of 1951 convention relating to the status of refugees that should be, that should be taken as an element of connect between regional understanding and international application of this particular, expression. Because it was a few years after the Second World War, and Nazi Germany had killed almost 9 million people in the Holocaust, including 6 million Jews, and displaced millions more. The community of nation states and their leaderships wanted to ensure that the protection of refugees and the protection for those displaced by war and persecution, some kind of a protection must be envisioned under international law. However, despite a lot of negotiations, parleys at summit level or at a plenipotentiary level, they have not been successful in finding a single definition of refugee suitable for all purposes, but when it is associated with humanitarian aims. The connotation of this particular expression, refugee, differs from that used in international agreements, since the human aspect of the refugee problem are clearly distinct, my dear friends, from the question of a refugee's status in any given situation. Therefore, all refugees have in common 3 important characteristics, and these characteristics should never be forgotten. They are, number 1, uprooted. They are, number 2, homeless. And at the same time, my dear friends, number 3, they lack national protection as a citizen, as some kind of a status under international law. Therefore, if you take into account further what exactly is the conceptual construction of the term refugee, at the very outset, let me recall what I have submitted today at the very outset of my submissions, the role of media. And particularly whether it is media, politicians, even general public, they generally describe anyone who has been obliged to abandon his or her home or usual place of residence in any geopolitical entity anywhere in the world, and finds himself in the country of reception or in the refugee hosting country. They are generally addressed in one single vocabulary, and that is known as refugee. Normally, when this is used in this particular understanding or in a general and very simple manner, my dear friends, a little effort is made to distinguish between people who have had to leave their own country and those who have been displaced within their homeland. Is much attention paid to the causes of flight, whether people are escaping from persecution, political violence, communal conflict, ecological disasters, poverty, or any kind of poverty. They are all assumed to qualify for the title of refugee. They are generally addressed as refugees. But being a student of international refugee law, it is our duty. It is our fundamental responsibility to make and take note of these distinctions when we are addressing some foreigners who have fled because of multiple reasons. And we should try to appreciate the problem of their flight and their, the magnitude of their relocation, I should call it, on the basis of these grounds. Because refugee has been the subject of treaties and other international agreements. Therefore, it is impossible to give one single definition or to provide one single definition to describe these people, which could be used in all circumstances. So we do not have an umbrella, what we call, definition. Despite the fact that we have been grappling the definition that has been, provided under 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. This reminds me, as I have, said and submitted at the very first, what we call, in my opening remarks of today, that there are, different kind of, perspectives. There are different notions of, notions of understanding. There are different indoctrinations, ideological indoctrinations, intellectual affiliations, philosophical foundations, upon which we try to understand, and the adherents of different, school of thoughts understand this particular expression. So few important expressions and few ideologies I have also, collected, and I would like to, what we call, share those ideological indoctrinations, how to understand this particular, term that is known as refugee. This reminds me of one of the most important asseveration of a professor. I am talking about the Professor Goodhart, who observed, my dear friends, he provided a sociological definition of this particular, expression called refugee. It is in inverted commas, my dear friends. A sociological definition of the term refugee differs from a legal one. The definition drafted for the purposes of binding international agreement will look very different from the definition adopted by an association with a humanitarian aid, unquote. So you can understand that there is a, legal angle to this, definition. There is also a sociological angle to this definition. Because when we have adopted a legal definition of a binding character and applicable to refugees, then it looks very different from a, understanding of this, definition if it is applied to an association which is engaged in a humanitarian action. Therefore, in general terms, my dear friends, a refugee is usually thought of a person compelled to flee his state of origin or residence due to political troubles, persecution, famine, or natural disasters. A man's status or an individual's status as a refugee is determined first and foremost by the factors which led or generally lead to his, condition, expatriation, and the, breaking of ties that bound him to the state of his nationality. That is one of the important, situation. A refugee is distinguished from an ordinary alien because of the lack of normalcy of relationship between him and the authorities of his states of origin. And this, condition arises from the fear of political persecution. Political persecution in a situation when he returns to his country of origin. Because this is the, fear that ultimately compelled him to flee from persecution in his country of nationality. Therefore, refugee is distinguished from the refugee is perceived as an involuntary migrant, a victim of circumstances which force him to seek sanctuary in a foreign country. It's a normal, practice. It's a normal, situation. Recently, 3 or 4 days back, there was an earthquake. And the epicenter of the earthquake happens to be in Kazakhstan or in Central Asia, my dear friends. And it was measured at the Richter scale 6.1. Intensity was there. But in Delhi, we also felt its, tremors, because there has been some kind of a changes in the tectonic plates. So the seismological activity, whose epicenter happens to be hundreds of thousands of kilometers away from New Delhi, but we felt the tremors. And the people who felt these, tremors immediately, without losing a second, to run out of their, residences. Even they could not pick up, my dear friends, their phones. That is the most important companion in the current, circumstances. Nobody can, leave his or her phone. Phone has become such a, companion of all of us. We are always, glued to it. So there were, people, because very first priority of an individual in today's circumstances is the possession of his, cell phone. So people left their phone. They could not collect. They could not collect the minimum requirement for human survival, and that too in winter session, in the weather of winter. So you can very well understand. So in such a situation, how we have been, viewing refugees. So in case of persecution, my dear friend, people generally do not take their even minimum continuum of their requirements along with them, what to talk of travel documents. So it is very natural. When there is a persecution, when there is a, persecution on the basis of political opinion, persecution on the basis of, non-following a conscription policy, persecution on the basis of, communalism, persecution on the basis of, religion, external aggression, foreign occupation, membership of a political, group, or membership of a, social group. These are some of the important, grounds. It is basically the liberal interpretation of extending some kind of a relief to the person who have been, fleeing persecution, have also been provided in the UNHCR handbook, how to determine or determining refugee status. We would also be coming to that particular aspect in the next engagement. But what is important is that refugees under all circumstances should be distinguished. Refugee generally perceived as an involuntary migrant, my dear friends. He is, considered as a victim of his, surroundings, circumstances, situations, and these, the cumulative impact of these, circumstances, conditions, surroundings, generally, compel him, force him to flee, because there is a fear of persecution, and that fear of persecution, compels him or compelled him or her to flee and take sanctuary in another, country. Therefore, similar is the case, my dear friends, with that of a stateless, person, because he, unlike the stateless, persons, may still have a de jure national status, because their population is still in a kind of a, or in a state of, limbo. They have been waiting for the full-fledged, what we call, a restoration of their national, rights. This takes me to another important, definition, my dear friends, that has also been, provided, and that is a definition that comes to my mind of, Professor or Sir John Hope Simpson, or so I can call it the Simpson's, definition. And Sir Simpson's definition goes like this, my dear friends, because Sir John Simpson has written one particular, what we call, conducted a survey, and the survey is known as the refugee problem. This is a survey which he has conducted in the year in 1939, where, and this survey has been, published by the Oxford University Press, and he defines or tries to define a refugee like this. I quote: the essential quality of a refugee is that he has sought refuge in a territory other than that in which he was formerly resident as a result of political events which render his continued residence in his former territory impossible or intolerable. A very simple definition, I unquote. So you can very well understand that there are basically some important criteria, and one of the most important essential quality of a refugee is that a refugee tries to take refuge other than his or her territory of his former residence or his nationality, and he take refuge simply on the ground of political events because a very overarching, very comprehensive kind of understanding he attributes to a person's what he call fleeing persecution. So in 1939, this understanding has also been there, the political events which rendered his continued residence impossible, intolerance, inhospitable in his former residence. So that is the Sir John Hopkins Simpson's definition of refugee. So many attempts have been made, my dear friends. So therefore we can say that the refugee definition answers the question, who is a refugee? It is the definition that should be invoked to answer this particular question. Even in your examination, if I am offering a question like who is a refugee or define refugee, then the definition is the answer, because all the grounds have been provided. And when we are talking of what are the grounds to determine the refugee status, again we have to invoke definition. Therefore definition applies to individuals as well as a group of people or group of individuals and persons. Being a refugee entitles the person or to a person lot of rights, including the right not to be sent back to the country of origin. That is the most important qualification. Once a refugee status has been sought, then it is one of the fundamental principles of non-refoulement. Then the person should not be sent back to his country of origin. He should be allowed to continue his residence as a refugee in the hosting country. And that is one of the most important question. When I was discussing while organizing an interactive meeting with all the members of fourth semesters, particularly not all members of the fourth semester, all the students, rather the LLM dissertation students. Then a very, very important question was put to me by one of my student, Mr. Muhammad Imran. I organized a separate session. Only one student, that is Mr. Muhammad Imran, has reported and had a discussion, online discussion with me. He was talking a very novel idea. And because of this novel idea, I had to attend a webinar, which I have just mentioned, organized by the Oxford University's Center for Refugee Studies. And I put the same question because I wanted an international expertise as a response to his question. Because if students are asking something, though I have interacted, I have responded very positively to his question, but at the same time I felt that I should also elicit the international opinion beyond South Asia, what exactly is going to be the answer to this particular question. So I put this particular question. It was an expert who was, speaking from the McMaster University. Another fellow was, from, University of Toronto. And one resource person was from the Oxford University itself. So they have also realized, cumulatively speaking, collectively, they have realized that this is a dimension which has not been addressed so far by the international scholarship in the area of international refugee law. And that is right to compensation, right to seek damages from the country of nationality of refugees by the whole refugee hosting countries from a particular or for a particular community of refugees. Suppose if we are as a India, if India is hosting refugees from Afghanistan and Bangladesh, then does India or will India be able to seek any kind of a compensation from Bangladesh or from Afghanistan for hosting their nationals in India as a refugee hosting country? It's a very, very important dimension under international refugee law on which Mr. Mohammad Imran is, working, and it is one of his, research questions. So this is the, gray area, and this is what I have submitted to Mr. Imran, that it is a very, very important opportunity, my dear friend, that you got a chance to fill this gap. That particular research question is going to establish you as a credible authority for subsequent citations if you are coming out with a credible work on these aspects. Because it has not been adequately addressed, my dear friends, by the scholarship of the global North nation states. One gentleman whose name I am forgetting is presently engaged with one of the important dimensions, which is an incidental dimension of this particular question in South Africa. So if you take into account all these notions and the attempts which have been made even prior to the what we call First World War, interwar, and post Second World War, then there are still some important gray areas which have not been addressed in a manner or in a fashion in which they should have been addressed. So this is my sincere what we call understanding, and this is what I implore you, that please, dissertation is a very serious business, very, very serious business. Because from the same institution, that is the South Asian University, many dissertations in the form of research papers have been published in Oxford journals, in Cambridge journals, and they're two of the students. So please remember, there are students, your seniors who have already passed out. We have their dissertations in the form of research papers published in Asian Journal of Law, in Chinese Journal of International Law, so and many other important comparative journals published by the Oxford University Press as well as Cambridge University Press. So please be careful when you are writing dissertation. Dissertation should never be undertaken as a formality project. No, it should be taken as a profound project of your intellectual engagement. So this is my sincere submission on this point, because it arises during our deliberations. That is why I have shared, because of the topic of Mr. Mohammad Imran, your classmate, and I think he is also there. So refugee definition, cumulatively speaking, my dear friends, refugee definition is declaratory in nature. It means a person is a refugee as soon as he or she fulfills the criteria contained and prescribed, contemplated In 1951, UN Convention relating to the status of refugees, along with its additional protocol of 1967. And this would necessarily occur prior to a formal determination of her or his refugee status. Until such circumstances or until such determination is made, it must be assumed that those who have crossed an international border, my dear friends, and they have been taking the risk of escaping of Syria from the serious harm in their country of origin are refugees and should be treated as such. Therefore, on a more micro level, my dear friends, 1951 UN Convention definition of refugee under international law, as it has been initiated under Article 1, the term refugee begins with any person who, as a result of, we should forget these expressions, as a result of events occurring before 1 January 1951, because this expression has already been removed by adopting subsequently an additional protocol to 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees. Therefore, the definition starts. If I strictly go by the language that has been used in 1951 Refugee Convention under Article 1, though there are other important classes, A class, B clause, there are classes and clauses, and these clauses have also created a lot of classes of refugees. So it begins with owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable, or owing to such fear is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. So if you evaluate this entire definition, how we are going to interpret it as the judicial officer, as a legal officer, as a legal advisor, how you are going to define and provide your interpretation of these kinds of definition. I had a chance of giving my interpretation to some of the important students, particularly students from Iraq and Palestine in India, because once I have been appointed during my earlier institutional engagement, that was in Aligarh Muslim University, where as an assistant professor, as an assistant proctor, another brief was also given to me, and that was relating to, within inverted commas, it was a position advisor to the international students or international student advisor position, by virtue of my being an assistant proctor. So interpretation, what kind of an interpretation you are asking for? So as a student of international refugee law, what is going to be your responsibility? My friends from South Asian University, particularly from the Faculty of International Relations or Department of International Relations, have been there on Bangladesh television, and they have been invited as refugee experts. When this entire Rohingya refugees exodus started populating Cox's Bazar area of Bangladesh, I have received their emails because they have studied international refugee law in South Asian University as an optional subject. They have shared their video clips, which have already been shared on YouTube. Because of this paper, they acknowledged that because of the South Asian University, they were able to have some kind of a clarity, some kind of a crystallization of this kind of an issue. Though they have specialized in international relations, but because of their optional paper, the current one, that is international refugee law, they also get or got additional benefits. So it is very, very important interpretation of international refugee law, particularly of this nodal convention, that is the main subject matter, and that is 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees. So what kind of an interpretation, what kind of a perspective we are going to attribute it? What kind of a the ideological indoctrination is there, whether it is predominant one or the post-dominant one, in the capacity of a refugee status determination official or a judge or some kind of a quasi-judicial capacity or judicial capacity or administrative capacity, and seized with this kind of a issue, how to determine refugee status, then interpretation of this definition becomes very, very important and central for the reception as well as the restoration of their rights or extending a range of rights on humanitarian grounds. Therefore, there are different dimensions of how to determine, how to not only determine, but at the same time how to visit this definition and invoke some kind of a understanding for the redressal of their sufferings. Suppose take the example, when we are talking of interpretation, take the example of comparative law. We have been the student and we are a student of the comparative law, the comparative constitutional law of our nations. So we are going to visit this definition with a mindset, with an understanding, with a lot of juridical, intellectual, and philosophical understanding of the constitutional principles, how to visit this particular definition. So therefore, my dear friends, if you invoke a comparative law, then what do we study under comparative law? We study court decisions, laws and regulations, not only of our country, because I am using the expression comparative law. It means we have to understand the jurisprudence that has been developed by the municipal legal systems in other regions. We have to believe and we have to invoke the migration of constitutional ideas on this particular interpretation, that is how to define a refugee, how to extend, how to restore their rights, and how to provide extend humanitarian assistance and aid to refugees individually as well as collectively. So under comparative law, what has been the law on refugees in the municipal legal system of the United States of America, because they have already passed various legislations like Immigration Act of 1924. Immigration, again, that was updated in the year 1962. Then again, subsequently, they have also came out with another important piece of legislation, and that piece of legislation is known as the Refugee Act of 1980. Then we have to take into account what exactly is the municipal legal system of Australia and what kind of a judgments have been there. So when there is a question of how to determine refugee status, it is a party to 1951 the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees and how they have viewed the refugee problem in their municipal legal system. Then how Italy, Germany, Spain, France, Belgium, what exactly are the contours of immigration policies as well as the asylum policies of these geopolitical entities from Europe. So we have to including United Kingdom, and at the same time we should not forget what kind of an impact has been there of the Brexit on asylum seekers in UK. It's a new dimension which is of late emerging, particularly from the very first day of the current year, that is say 2021. So we have to take, and this is always determined on the basis of my dear friends, on the basis of interpretation of comparative law. So comparative law becomes a necessity to understand international refugee law definition or the definition of a refugee. So comparatively we have to understand. Then another important dimensions, first it is the comparative law, and I am of the view that the constitutional law must not be forgotten. And this is the strength of refugees, particularly in those countries where there is no national law on refugees, particularly in those countries where the countries of destination or the transit country or the country of reception do not have, and they are not privy to 1951 Refugee Convention. So it becomes very, very important that the constitutions of such kind of countries, or these countries' constitutions, basically provide and they extend a lot of what we call support to refugees, whether it is the constitution of Bangladesh. Then the refugees have sought what we call refuge under Article 31, 32, and 33 of the Constitution of Bangladesh. In case of India, it is Article 21 that provides an extent a lot of leverage and support and humanitarian assistance to refugees. And this is what many organizations which are having some global persons, many organizations of national character in India, they have also what we call came out and pleaded before a court of law in India under Article 21 and rescued refugees. And even in Pakistan, the similar, it is the constitution. At the same time, even in Afghanistan, it is the constitution which is protecting refugees. Same is the situation in Nepal and Bhutan. Even Bhutan, who does not have, even the term refugee has not been used in the constitution, or no constitution uses this kind of expressions even then. And prima facie speaking, if you go through the constitution of Bhutan, you will not find, but if you read very deeply and profoundly, you will find Article 7 of that very constitution, where the refugee protection has been envisioned or could be envisioned. So, my dear friends, comparative law, and I am of the view comparative constitutional law becomes very, very important, because the court decisions, laws, regulations, juristic writings emanating from these fields of the comparative constitutional law, they provide some kind of a foundation for refugee protection at the level of what we call interpretation. Another important area, that is the UNHCR's handbook. If you take into account, I will share definitely this handbook, that is UNHCR handbook, and whatever the guidelines and the executive committee conclusions, which are popularly known as the EXCOM recommendations or conclusions, or the decisions, as well as the notes and paragraphs, principles, which have been jotted down by the national representatives of various geopolitical entities in this particular committee, that is the Executive Committee on Refugees, monitored by the UNHCR, that is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, as a subsidiary organization of under UN Charter. Then these conclusions, recommendations, and notes also provide, and this should also be taken as an aid in determining the refugee status. Another important dimension that should also be taken, and that is the dimension of works of scholars. What kind of a scholarship is available at international level, and what kind of works have also been contributed. Then the works of scholars cannot be undermined by the judicial officers, by the RSD officials, I mean the refugee status determination officials, or administrative officers in a geopolitical entity, or some ad hoc what you call apparatus of an administrative character which has been institutionalized by various geopolitical entities in the absence of any kind of a national refugee legislation, in the absence of their ratification of this particular international treaty on refugees, that is 1951 Refugee Convention. So they should also be taken into consideration. I mean, the scholarship which is available, scholarship like James C. Hathaway, a very towering personality in the field of refugee law, whose work is of immense importance, my dear friends. Thousands and thousands of times he has been cited by various scholars. James C. Hathaway. Unfortunately, I had a chance to get his review of my pre-publication review of one of my submissions, And I am fortunate enough that from his busy schedule from the University of Michigan, he was able to provide, and he reframed the title of my submission, and that has been subsequently published. So James Hathaway is a very important authority, and his scholarship cannot be underestimated. That desired a very profound view. Another one is Professor Gaius Goodwin. We cannot, at the level of interpretation, it is the fundamental responsibility of RSD officials as well as the judicial minds in a geopolitical entity to look upon, to consult the works of these scholars. So there is a complete list of what we call of scholars. As I have mentioned, James C. Hathaway, Erica Feller, Harald Bond, Professor S. Gaius Goodwin, Anker, Madam Nebon, Legumsky, Alan Koff, Gloucester, Jem McAdam, Professor Chimney, Professor Matwa, and other important scholars. And there are many more scholars available. So their works on numerous occasions, particularly by the European Court of Human Rights, Inter-American System of Human Rights, as well as some African Union Court and other national jurisdictions and their judicial systems have in the particularly in global North nation states judicial systems heavily relied upon these scholarships, and these scholarships have really shaped the judicial minds when understanding who is a refugee and what should be the proper what we call shape of their rights, limitations, and how to determine the province of rights which is available to refugees. Let me clarify at this stage, my dear friends. The definition uses very important expression, though I have already explained it to you, and that is events occurring before 1 January 1951. And why I am taking this particular expression as a separate what we call expression and leaving aside the rest of the what we call continuity, and that constitute the whole definition. So I'm going to take up one expression after another, after other expressions. So we would be in a better position to appreciate the different what we call contours of these definitional aspects. If you take into account this entire convention, I mean 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees, then prima facie speaking, my dear friends, though today it is recognized as international law on refugees, but we should not forget that initially when it was framed, then this date which I have just mentioned becomes very important. Important in the sense that primarily this particular arrangement and framework for the refugee protection that was designed, it was primarily designed as a Eurocentric framework for the protection of refugees in the post-Second World War era. That was the intention, and that too under the auspices of the United Nations Organization. Though it was a regional problem, it has been perceived by the international community under the auspices of the United Nations Organization at that point of time as a regional problem which was limited to Europe alone. So therefore, it is one of the most important and credible allegation against this particular convention that it is a Eurocentric convention. It does not, and it is one of the first bone of contention that is that emanates from the global South nation states against the individualization of the refugee problem. Whereas, as I have already on other important occasions, I have submitted, if you recall, that the global South nation states generally take into account the collectivization of the refugee problem. It is the communitarianism of refugee problem that is very dear, that is very close to the heart of South Asian nation states as well as the global South nation states. It is the communitarian nature of humanitarianism that is the most appealing argument, and this is something that has been expounded by the scholars from the global South nation states. But it is different. It is contrary what we receive in the global North nation states. It is primarily the concept of individualism. It is the individualization, my dear friends, that has been reflected and envisioned and imagined in the rubrics of 1951 Refugee Convention. So therefore, we can say, my dear friends, that refugees have been perceived under this particular convention, which after 2003 has become a permanent feature of international law. It has been primarily and initially perceived as a temporary phenomenon, because it has been thought at the very initial stage that refugee problem is of an ephemeral nature. It is going to be resolved in near future. But it is altogether a different understanding that has been realized by the community of nation states at the very beginning of the 21st century, in the very initial years of the 21st century, in the very first decade of the 21st century, that it is going to be a permanent feature. Because as long as we are going to be there on this beautiful planet, refugees are going to be an accident feature. So it has become a permanent phenomenon. So therefore, the refugees who survived, or the survivors of the World War II, who happened to be on the move, reflects also at the same time some ideological choices and international compromise. At the same time, my dear friends, other international human rights instruments which have been what we call formed, concluded or enacted, but before the what we call before the feminist movement got some kind of empowerment, because the gender neutrality, or the how the women as well as children, they have been excluded from this definition of 1951, that really gives a very horrendous situation. It has been perceived in many of the situations, my dear friends, whether there is a war or any kind of a conflict of a international character or non-international character armed conflict, the biggest what we call casualties have been suffered, or these biggest what we call magnitude or magnitudinal sufferings have always been received and endured by the women and children. So they constitute a very important stakeholders when there is a question of international protection of refugees. And this is something which we find amiss in this particular. So if you take into account this understanding, my dear friends, if you take the subsequent understandings, suppose there is an expression again in the definition, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted, within inverted commas, I stop at this understanding. Owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted, what does it convey? How do you define? How do we perceive? Or in a very simple manner, prima facie speaking, if I put a question to all of you, my dear friends, what is fear? How should we try to define what exactly are the contours of fear, whether the fear is going to be subjective, or is there any kind of a possibility to achieve the objective elements or objectivity in defining and determining fear? What should be the correct criteria of fear? Is there any kind of a yardstick or criteria for the assessment of fear? Is there any kind of a format? Can we draw some kind of a diagram of fear? How to understand the idea of fear? What are the responsibilities which have been envisioned in the UNHCR handbook for the determination of refugee status? What are the qualifications of RSD officials, refugee status determination personnel and officials? What are the limitations of questions and what are the laxities which are available to these officials in asking questions? What kind of a language should be used? What are the requirements of interpretation? Who is the right interpreter of this state of fear? Whether the officials have been empowered to make an interpretation of fear, whether they are capable enough to have an interpretation of the body language of a refugee who is seeking some kind of favor or demanding or seeking refugee status in the host country. What are the responsibilities and duties of the border enforcement officials? There are a host of questions. But one of the most important and pertinent questions that still remains to be answered, and that is owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted. Well-founded fear. The word fear has been prefixed with an adjective which is known as well-founded. So that well-foundedness, what is the criteria to cajole, to rummage, to evaluate, and to cavil the nuances and niceties involved in determining, defining, investigating the idea of fear? Yes, Mr. Muhammad Imran, you wanted
Yes,
to
sir.
say something. Yeah,
Yes,
please.
sir. I just wanted to answer quickly about this question and how should we go about the idea of well-founded fears. I think, sir, Professor Afiqul Islam writes that though lots of things depend upon the state who is hosting the refugees, uh, in any case, the refugee must fulfill the objective as well as the subjective criteria of well-founded fear. For example, he gives a very interesting example. He says, uh, a group of people, because refugee convention defines refugees in individual level. It does not say that refugee right is a collective right. So say he says that there is one person who thinks that he might be persecuted for his political opinion. This presumption does not create a valid ground for seeking asylum in any other country. So I think the meaning of well-founded fear means there must be some substance that because of his religious opinion or his religious identity or political opinion, he is going to be persecuted in the state where he is living. So this is what I could understood from the text.
Hmm. So I will also share this book of Rafiqul Islam from Bangladesh. I will share rather the entire SARC scholarship and books as a separate what we call email, in a separate email which is available to us. So there are many other important scholars from South Asia who has contributed immensely in the field of international refugee law. Yes, very correct. Any other observation from my friends? May I have your views, Miss Prakriti Malla?
Yes, sir. Like
Yeah,
I can
please.
say here, the fear has been motivated by the use of executive well-founded. So this gives an idea that the threshold of fear that the person is feeling or having is something higher than that of what we usually perceived. So I feel like this somehow restrict the liberal interpretation of the term refugee, because in one hand we are emphasizing on the fact that the refugees should be treated in a liberal manner. They should not be asked with the documents because there is no possibility of submitting that. But in the other hand, the use of such terminology like well-founded fear is like somehow restricting in the liberal interpretation of the meaning of the refugee, because it requires some higher threshold. So this somehow found to be conflicting. I think there is a need of reconciling these things, and it is very difficult to map out what exactly is well-founded fear, because it is something that may differ from your opinion to mine. So like, so it's very difficult, though here the terminology has been kept, but in practice I found it is completely impossible to map out what exactly well-founded fear means.
Very good. Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, Mr. Awal Khan, may I have the liberty to elicit your inputs?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please.
So I think it would be very difficult to draw some criteria for peer because what I think, if someone is prosecuted or someone life is in danger in some places, so if this person prove that, so I think refugee status should be granted to that particular person.
Very true. Very true.
Yeah.
Mr. Vikas, may I have your intellectual blessings, brother? Yeah. Yeah, both of you are correct, my dear friends. This is something which I have also read in Rafiqul Islam's scholarship, because he has written a book which is known as Introduction to International Refugee Law, where from my friend Mr. Muhammad Imran has also shared his observations. Ms. Prakriti Malla, you have rightly pointed out. But this expression, this is the opening or rather I should say, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted should be taken as a preambular propositions when we are studying the contours for determining refugee status or refugee claims as a refugee status. Because well-founded fear means that a refugee has a solid grounds, credible grounds, unimpeachable grounds, unprecedented credibility is reflected in his observations and claims entitlements as a refugee, and they are facing the real dangers to their existential survival in their country of origin. Let me break this expression owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted into two broad categorizations. Well-founded fear, that is one fragment, and another fragment is of being persecuted. So when we are taking the very first fragment, it means there is a requirement of making a persons of unprecedented criteria based on profound grounds of fear. beyond any reasonable doubt. And the real jeopardy or threshold of jeopardy should also be there when we are talking of well-founded fear. But if you take the second part of the second fragment of the same expression, and that is of being persecuted, then, my dear friends, a refugee fears being oppression, hostility, and violence so bad that it forces them to leave their country. It means leaving of country is the only option available to him. He cannot take any kind of a shelter, sanctuary, or refuge anywhere in his country of origin. That is the meaning of being persecuted. Because it has attained some kind of a unprecedented situation. If a person does not move, if a person does not cross an international border, under all circumstances, he is going to be eliminated physically. He may suffer some kind of permanent privation of his limbs. That kind of a situation. So there happens to be a sense of fear that is hovering. So therefore, when we are saying of being persecuted, it means existential threat is there, and that is present. Hostility of a high magnitude is going to be responsible, and there happens to be unprecedented violence that has instilled a sense of fear in the minds of targeted community. But at the same time, we should be mindful of the fact, my dear friends, when we are talking of being persecuted, it must be prospective, number one element, number one requirement. At the same time, there is a possibility of the past prosecution. There is a difference between persecution and prosecution. But of late, what we have been witnessing, the word persecution has become the result, and the process has attained the status of prosecution, because there are false what you call allegations which are generally leveled, and the people have been persecuted. So the past prosecution constitutes a very, very important element of persecution or being persecuted. But in the real or strict interpretation, if we take, then we find that the past prosecution is not required. And generally it has been seen that it is an insufficient element of a being persecuted fragment. Let me go to the chat box. Mr. Muhib is also having an understanding. I must share his understanding to all of you, or with all of you. Mr. Muhib is saying that as per his understanding, refugee is a person who compelled to flee his country due to persecution, security issues, war and violence. Yes, I understand. You are absolutely correct, my dear friend. Majority of the definitions which we have studied or have been studying or would study, they encapsulate your line of argument. Because there are issues of persecution. You have used the two important categorizations at a time: persecution and the reasons of persecution. Reasons of persecution, as you have mentioned, Mr. Muhib, is security issues, war and violence. Yes, definitely, people have been fleeing. If somebody is not having in a particular locality a sense of security, that under those hostile circumstances, an individual is compelled to flee and leave his what we call locality. And that is the reasons you will find there happens to be a global phenomenon. And what kind of a global phenomenon it is? It is a phenomenon that ultimately pander to the ghettoizations of the world populations in all the geopolitical entity, and these ghettoizations are religion-driven ghettoizations. Now we have been witnessing, though it has always been the feature in some what we call if you study the ghettoizations, my dear friend, you will also, I am not what we call invoking that kind of a ghettoizations which we have witnessed at the hands of Hitler in Poland, or in some other what we call localities, particularly in Poland, France, Austria, when Germany invaded these countries. It was purely and purely race-driven ghettoizations. But not only today we are having the ghetto-driven ghettoizations, but at the same time we are also witnessing the religion-driven ghettoizations of populations. In South Asia, it is not basically the ghettoizations, rather it is in certain situations is a tribalizations, racializations, castizations. So these have been the factors which we witness, my dear friends, in our demographical settings, whether we are living in a village, in a city, whether it is the rural settings or the urban settings. This is something sociologically speaking, and there are credible sociological studies. We can what we call witness and study those important surveys. Why there is a divisions of urban centers of human habitation, rural centers of human habitation on caste lines, religion lines. Why there happens to be a polarization or of our localities, our societies. I am also having some vivid experiences which are not at all desirable to be shared at this stage. Very soon I will definitely come out with certain well documented experiences which have been what we call endured by people hailing from different marginalized sections of South Asia and beyond South Asia. And in certain situations, even the most cosmopolitan societies have also experienced, and the cosmopolitanism of one kind has been at loggerheads with that of other cosmopolitanism of other kind. So there is no dearth of what we call of evaluating these important dimensions when we are basically evaluating the thresholds of well-founded fear of being persecuted or of being persecuted. I will continue. Thank you very much, my dear friends. But before I leave, let me go through another very important and detailed what we call continuation of Mr. Muhib's observation. He goes further and says, now the question which comes to my mind is that security issues also could be the criteria for a person to be known as refugee. For example, a person flee from Afghanistan to India and claim that due to security issues I came here, I must receive all the right of refugee as has given by international convention. Can he claim such rights? I will definitely attend, my dear friends, tomorrow's class, and I will start my submissions with your question. But before I leave, we will have to analyze the entire what we call brolly of security issues. We have to we cannot take some kind of a satisfaction if somebody is speaking that there are security issues. We have to decipher what exactly is the meaning of security issues. What exactly are the contours of this expression called security issues? So we would be deciphering, and all the other important incidental and connected issues with this umbrella expression which you have used, security issues, and thereafter I will come out with credible responses on my part. So thank you very much for the day, my dear friends. Enjoy yourself. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, brother. Thanks a lot.